Before we dive in, the panel will be broken out into 4 distinct sections here. We're going to start off with design system and business pains, move on over into getting visibility for your design system. After that, talk about making improvements to your design system, and then finally end off the session here with proving its value. So with that, we can go ahead and get started with a question that I'm going to go ahead and direct to Dan, since you're the last one to talk. Let's start with measuring the success of design systems. There are a lot of approaches to measurement. What kind of team should be measuring design system adoption, and what do adoption metrics tell you?
Lots of easy questions. Thanks for the tee up there, Nico. I think that design system adoption is important. I also think that design system adoption is as important as a restaurant making edible food. So I don't think it's the bar that we're trying to achieve, but I think it's something that without achieving adoption, all the rest of the stuff that we're doing, actually, we can't get, right? It's a thing that we need. We need, in order to drive certain business metrics, we need to have adoption for components and tokens and, all the things that design system teams are working on. So I think it's an important thing. A lot of things that I try to encourage teams to focus on is, what are the immediate business metrics that you could move with the design system? How can you tie to that as quickly as possible? I think without that, a lot of times, and this is a controversial idea, that design systems, I think, lately have been talked about as infrastructure. We can think about them as infrastructure. And I think that that's true, but I think it kind of relegates design systems to a place where it's then viewed as a cost center as opposed to a profit driver. And I think that it creates different conversations about it. So with a lot of the teams that I work with, I tend to encourage them to go like, how can we make design systems a profit driver? How can we make it move business impact? How can we tie it to the most recent OKRs of the quarter organizationally, and then have the design systems OKRs themselves or metrics tied to that? And how can we bring those things together? So a lot of times I like starting in that place.
Awesome. Fantastic, Dan. And throw it over to Zach too. As a practitioner, what is your take on that too? Do you often find yourself trying to tie it to business objectives as well too? Or, what is the key thing that you're looking for over at GoFundMe?
Yeah, I think measuring adoption is good for teams that have already kind of reached that critical mass of adoption. Um, and you're looking for more insight into like how the design system is used, what are the most used components, least components, that type of thing. Um, but I do also think that, there is value in trying to influence business OKRs as well. I think that's super important. Some of the topics we'll get into a little bit later, we'll get more into that for sure.
Awesome. Fantastic. And sort of switching gears a little bit to Nathan, one of the things that you had mentioned when we were discussing before was about how teams should measure what's going to most directly result in understanding how their system is impacting their customers, or how their customers should change as a result. Could you add some things to that, or, tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think so. Design system work can sometimes be quite emotional. Like, you want to be driven. You want some intrinsic and extrinsic sort of rewards for all the things that you're doing. And the light bulb goes off for some people when you say, you realize when you launch your design system, you have a shiny new documentation site, you put a bunch of component packages on a registry, you feel like you're done with the work. But actually the moment that gives me the most energy isn't when my work is published and released. It's when products release into production using our stuff. And when those products actually succeed, we're helping them succeed. And that's where I like how Dan's orienting around the business objectives. I want to go where the work is. One of my best experiences was when we were invited in as a member of the design, or as a member of the product community, to sit in on semi-annual or annual product planning and see where the work is, sort of listen and look around, and oh, these 3 teams are doing heavy UI redevelopment from the ground up. Those 2 teams are doing infrastructure work that we can't impact at all. Suddenly I've narrowed my focus to 3 more achievable goals. And then I can orient and say, okay, 9 months from now, 12 months from now, when they go into production, they'll have gone into production using our stuff. What more do they need? Let's talk more. And that's where, to me, adoption is so critical. Know who is going to use your work to create change in the days that come.
Fantastic. And I think that it's a great transition into our next topic of, there seems to be a significant gap between maybe potential benefits of design systems versus their actual adoption. Some teams may be struggling with adoption. So of course, Nathan, you spoke to how you are currently seeing ways to bridge that gap. But I might throw it back to Dan. What are some other ways to bridge that gap and motivate broader adoption of design systems in general?
I think one of the things that design system teams are guilty of, and I'm guilty of it as well, when working with them a lot of times, is that we love design systems. So we talk about design systems all the time. And that's cool. That's great from a technician standpoint, from a craft standpoint. And the hard truth that I've learned in working with a lot of teams is that that's not important to everybody. And so the people who do have the ability to fund, or maybe even more importantly, defund a design system, we have to speak their language sometimes, and oftentimes, and a lot of times their language is not the language of design systems. They don't talk about component props and APIs and connected symbols and things like that. Those are important to our work, and we can't do our work without that. But they have different language that they speak, and so we do have to speak the language of numbers. We do have to speak the language of things like retention, or things like turnover, or things like revenue, or things like profit, or things like growth. I think that a lot of designers and engineers don't have a lot of muscle memory or a lot of reps talking about those things. And I think that those are things where we are able to grow and practice those things. And as we get better at that practice, I think that's the thing that helps us with visibility, because now we're invited into conversations because we can speak those languages and we can have those conversations with folks. And so a lot of times it's about training the practitioners to be able to be part of those conversations. And even if not, to be able to contribute to it somehow. So if we can make a tie between how performant a component is or how accessible a component is, and again, tie that to a particular business metric, or I love what Nathan said, that, if we can go where the work is, and kind of speak the language and reframe our design system work in the framing of some of those business metrics that are important, like accessibility, or like performance, or like revenue, or like growth, or like community, or the things that are important at a higher level than just the design system. I think that helps elevate the design system to get more visibility.
That's awesome. Yeah. And just kind of throwing it back to Zach over here too, as our main man on the street, our practitioner here, would you say some of those are also, motivators or contributors for you, and something that your team looks out for as well when you're doing the work, or are there some different motivators for you?
Yeah, I love everything you just said, Dan. And just to add to that, the ultimate, if you want your design system to be valued by the organization like a product, so we're saying the design system is a product. It has one job, which is to provide value to its users, which are your coworkers. So you need to talk to your users, and again, they're your coworkers, so that's super easy. There's really no excuse not to. But if there's a gap between the potential benefits of the system and then it actually being used in production, talk to people and find out why they're not using it. Involve them even earlier and figure out what you can do to support their needs, because ultimately that is the design system's job.
Awesome. And when you have those conversations with it, is it sort of like a gotcha moment, like, hey, why aren't you using the system? We spent so much time putting it together. How do you usually like to approach those in your team specifically?
I like to frame the question as, what are the big challenges that you're currently facing, and how can the design system help you address those?
Awesome. Fantastic. That's great. I think that's a great wrap up for our very first section. We can sort of transition a little bit into getting visibility. So Nathan, I can throw it back over to you. One of the things that you had mentioned was that anyone producing anything that other people can use will learn about it to the degree that which it's used, by who, how much, and how often, and be prepared to act on it. So if you want, could you tell us a little bit more about that, and sort of like what kind of team should be measuring these and all of that?
Well, I think any team that is producing something that other people or other groups consume, they want to understand, is it getting used? Is my stuff making a difference? And really, when it comes down to thinking about adoption narrowly, or design system measurement broadly, you have to understand, okay, what am I trying to measure? What's being reused? And to me, orienting around the what, like a code package or a Figma component or something like that, is actually less important to me than who, by who. And so when you start to orient around basic questions, not just of what's being reused, but by who, how much, how, like what props are they using, how are they integrating it into their different places, you really start to then, as I teach people, you want to define what the question is that you're trying to answer. And then you want to actually identify how you're going to measure it. But ultimately, even if you've done those two things, you aren't doing enough, because if you're going to measure some things, you have to understand how you're going to behave based on what you see. Like, we're going to measure this thing because the actions we want to take later are this. So for example, who's using the system that hasn't used it before? And so, okay, first time repository package installation. Okay, well then why do we care? What are we going to do about it? Oh, let's reach out to that team, or let's automate an email that sends instructions, or sort of invites them to get consulting, or other kinds of things that we can do to support them. So it's not just about the measurement, it's about how it leads to action.
That's awesome. I remember too, so something Zach, you had mentioned as well too before, was that automation is key, especially for smaller teams too. So was that something that you have seen that's been successful for you as well too? Maybe automating, sending that email, helping, introduce people, onboard them to what you're building?
We typically like templatize those things versus automate the sending of the communications. Haven't really thought about that much. But it's a cool idea. But yeah, definitely templatize those things for sure. And yeah, looking forward to talk about the automation stuff later.
Awesome. And Dan, I saw you nodding quite a bit back there too. Is there anything you wanted to add there?
I think it fits right in line with the idea of design systems. It's like part of the premise of design systems is there are things that we've identified to have worked for many months or years, and those are the things that we don't want to have to reinvent anymore. And so automation fits really, really well into that idea, which is like there are some teams that are like, oh, another table to design. Why are we doing this again? Can we automate that? And that could range from a robot making that for us, or us using our words to have that crafted, to we actually already have a version of that we can reuse. And so I think there's a broad spectrum of the automation work, but I think at its core, that's at the nature of any system work, much less design systems too, is just being able to be more efficient about the stuff that we're like, we don't need to do that again in the hard way. We can do it in an easy way now. And so, automation is a really great tool when it comes to design systems for sure.
Yeah, hopefully that ease will help in that challenge of getting visibility for it to make it as easy as possible for somebody to come in and start using it right away. And one thing too, Dan, that you had mentioned before was that you actually encourage teams to spend more time agreeing on what matters rather than starting to set up measurements from the beginning. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. And, right along the lines of what Zach and Nathan had just mentioned, there are teams that spend a lot of time deliberating the best way to do something. And especially for early design teams, I work with a lot of teams that are very early in their design system journey. And for a lot of them, they spend a lot of time figuring out the minutia when they haven't figured out the big stuff yet. So it's like, well, let's figure out some of the big rocks, which is like, can we measure anything? And for a lot of teams, the answer is no, because they don't have before states, they don't have telemetry. And I think a lot of teams it's very alluring and compelling to see the future of that and going like, wouldn't it be great if we had an automated dashboard of something that they can every week just populates and pulls in things. And that's why tools like Omlet are so interesting and so great for teams. A lot of teams just aren't set up for that, right? And so starting slow and starting small is fine. I think that's okay. With a lot of teams that I work with who don't even have code bases yet, and even when they do, they don't have the ability to do the automation. A lot of times it's just setting up a practice. A lot of times you can solve technology things with workflow. You don't have to solve them with technology all the time. If we can set up a dashboard that's automated, that would be wonderful. But if we can't do that, how about every Friday we set aside an hour and we just count things manually? I've done that with a lot of teams where I go, okay, every Friday from 3 to 4 p.m., we're going to all get on a Zoom call and we're just going to count. We're just going to look through code bases and we're going to count, or we're going to have a handful of interviews and we're just going to ask things. I've seen a lot of buy-in and a lot of good fruit come from simple conversations where what we're reporting as a metric is we saved about a week of time, which is a total unscientific number, right? It's not like, oh, we saved 4.128 days. Sometimes just saying to an executive, like, we saved about a week of time for this team is enough for them to go, oh, that's interesting. Like, can we get more specific about that? And it gives the team some space to become more specific about it. And I think a lot of teams tend to overlook that step and go like, we really want to get to the minutia. We really want to get to the specific level of detail. And that's cool. It can just be a gradual process to get there.
Yeah, and Nathan, I saw some thumbs up from you too. Does that ring true for a lot of the teams that you work with?
It does. It not just for the teams, but my own personal belief system, because I come from a background, I have a master's in statistics. I'm all about precision and measuring uncertainty and all those things. And I think it's such a silly, foolish errand to think that Dan's 4.128, 129, something like whatever Dan said, like, who cares? You have no sense of any scale to measure at that level of precision. And so I love also that when you think about these things you want to measure, they start with conversations. They start with sort of discovery that feels sort of brute force manual, just looking around, hunting for some and looking for treasure. And then you really start to elevate not to the next step of automating a welcome message like I was talking about before, but the next step is you start to organize some of that data or track it in a spreadsheet manually. And then you start to realize, okay, there's more and more that matters to us that we're tracking in a spreadsheet that we should automate, because automating stuff is expensive. And if you start to automate things too soon and you start to invest in all of these things for numbers that actually don't provoke any action on your team, don't provoke any change in behaviors by your leadership, it's a total waste of time. And so starting and growing into the things that you want to measure that matter most is really important.
Awesome. And Zach, I saw some nods from you too. Does that ring true for you and the crew at GoFundMe, or did you approach it in a little different way, or what are you thinking about that?
Yeah, I think I maybe started to answer this a little bit earlier, got ahead of myself, but really like diving into more granular or more like accurate adoption metrics um, is not going to provide value to a team that's just trying to get the design system off the ground, or if the question is still kind of binary, like is the design system being used, and you can answer it with yes or no, um, and it's still no. Adoption metrics aren't going to help you a whole lot. So if the binary answer is yes, then you can start to get into, okay, well, how is it used, and dive a little bit deeper.
And that's where those interviews with your crew come into play and all that. So the big takeaway here, I think, is just talk to people, which is a great thing for anybody. Awesome, fantastic. That's a great little way to wrap up our section on getting visibility and transition a little bit into the making improvements section. So for teams listening that are trying to come up with their design system roadmap for 2024, what tips does the panel have today to use data into prioritizing those roadmaps and improving the most impactful areas? I can leave that question up to whoever's ready for it.
I'll take it first then.
Sounds good.
A couple of weeks ago, I did a webinar on design system planning, and what you can do there. And I think one of the pieces of data that I think a lot of teams overlook, which is oftentimes readily available, is I think design systems don't exist in a vacuum. They are a system that exists within a context of an organization that has many systems. And so a lot of teams, I think, try to have their own, a lot of design system teams that I've talked to try to have their own design system goals, which I think is admirable, but they forget to tie them to larger organizational goals too. So that's one piece of data that I think is really crucial, is knowing what your organization is doing for the next quarter or the next half or the next year, and going like, okay, if our big focus on the next year is, for example, accessibility, what can our design system do to prioritize accessibility and us moving forward in that, and making progress in that area? And what that might mean, and this is why it's a difficult thing to do, what that might mean is it means you have to deprioritize potentially some other things, where you might go, well, if we're going to do prioritize accessibility over this next year, then maybe we deprioritize performance over the next year, because it's more aligned with what everyone is in our company is doing. And I think at some level, systems, what makes it a system is the fact that it's connected to other things. And I think from a design system lens, we tend to think about that technologically, where our Figma files are hooked up to our React code bases and our metrics and our dashboards and all. And I think all of that is true. I think a lot of times we forget that we need to be connected to the goals of other teams and the work that they're doing and the roadmaps of other teams, so that our work is in parallel with theirs, or even better, implemented and integrated with theirs too. So to me, like, one of the first pieces of data is, what are other teams doing and why? What's important to them? And then how does that sit within the broader context of our organization?
Awesome. Going a little bit more granular here too. So one of the issues that we sometimes see, is that components or props don't actually see much adoption in production or code. So how would you go about diagnosing that sort of root cause and action? Nathan, you had a fun point of there are possibly too many to list. So how, where would you start in sort of diagnosing that lack of use there?
Well, it's interesting because you're zooming to such a granular level of a component has, let's say, 20 props to it, and each of those props have 3 options. Suddenly, I want to look at 60 things for a component. Like, I still want to zoom us out and think about, well, who really needs a button component that has those 20 props? And so I think it's really helpful to zoom into details like specific parts of the architecture or API of a component to learn about how it's being used, in particular for components that we're about to work on or that we're sensing aren't meeting the needs. But I want to zoom out the conversation back to sort of where Dan is at, which is like, can you even just name who your adopters are? And when I get in those conversations, it's difficult because I had one client, very large, sort of what do you call it? One of the largest companies that I've worked with, and I said, just in the rows of the spreadsheet, just name your different product teams. Can't do it. Like, walked away. I don't know who they are. Like, I can't. That seems too intimidating. Okay, can you just name a few of them that we're working with? No, I'm not going to do it. They 3 months couldn't fill out the spreadsheet. In another company, it was as if you name the 50 or so product teams that you're going to use. There are 50 rows in a spreadsheet. You name the design, dev, and product lead contact of each one of those. And then you just simply write, are they using the system? Yes or no? And then you write, okay, another quarter's gone by. Are they using it more? How have they changed? And suddenly you're having conversations where you walk into the organization with the leadership, and they're like, okay, we see how you group those 50 rows. Our KPIs or OKRs or whatever, we're calling a whole different classification of these products, and these products as part of what we're investing in. How are you going to help us? Well, I'll tell you right now, that first classification, nobody's using the design system and they're all going slow. Okay, that's a place where we can create change. And so, like, thinking about zooming in, I would and out in terms of the range of what you're talking about, I think is going to be important.
Fantastic. And then throwing it over to Zach too. Are these some of the things that you are experiencing yourself too at GoFundMe? Are you part of a larger team, or how does your structure look? And is it similar to what Dan and Nathan are saying here?
Yeah, we have a lot of engineers and much fewer designers. But yeah, I think when you dive into the data or dive into the source code or Figma files or whatever, and you're looking at the metrics and you're like, why isn't this component being used, or why aren't these props being used? Like, that's where you start, is why. And if you think about it critically for a moment, maybe like if those things were developed or designed in a vacuum without input from the teams, then they're likely missing the mark. And that's why, or maybe some teams they're not even aware of its existence, right? Like, how was the release of those things communicated and documented and things like that. So again, the data is useful, but it's just a starting point and a conversation starter.
Yeah, and I mentioned too, I remember you were mentioning that you always attend the bi-weekly front-end chapter meetings so you can stay on the beat as the product's front-end code evolves. Is this something that you think a lot of teams should start to adopt and start to develop?
Yeah, definitely. A lot of we say it a lot at GoFundMe is meet people where they are. It's not just for our customers, but for coworkers as well. So rather than introducing more friction or like another meeting for people to come to you to get design system updates or give you input, I think it's good to have things like office hours for sure. But go to their meetings, go to their already recurring meetings and figure out the updates they're sharing, find opportunities to share your updates there, so you're not introducing more friction there.
Awesome. And I might be breaking form here for a little bit, but I wanted to highlight there's one really incredible question that's getting a lot of attention here in the chat from Anne. I'll go ahead and highlight that here now, and we can open this up to the panel. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this for a little mid-panel question break here. So what do you do when you inherit a poorly started design system? There's a ton of stuff on how to start right from the beginning, but that's not always an option. So what would you all say to that?
Ask questions. and define what poorly means. Like, do their design tokens stink? Oh, I'm into that. I can help with that. Is it not being used by anybody? Then you have to ask a lot more questions.
I'm a big fan of the idea of progress over perfection. I think a lot of people aspire to have perfect design systems because we only have a handful of public ones that are, you know, that we see, and so we look up to the Material Designs and the Shopify Polarises and Lightnings and, you know, all of those kinds of things. And I think a lot of people, from my experience, they want that, you know, our version of Material Design or our version of Polaris, and those aren't good design systems for you. They're good design systems for those organizations. They're just not a good one for you because your criteria is different. If you're not an e-commerce site, why are you modeling after Polaris's design system? You know, like that's what it's for. And so I'm a big believer that, like, any state of a design system, you can always improve it with the next component that you work on or the next team that you work with. Like, and you can always make it better. So in a lot of ways, I see design system work as like you're sort of always at the beginning, or you can think of it as you're always at the beginning, even if the design system has been around for 5 years and it's got 100 components in it. Well, 101, you can change things. You know, that component can be the start of a new practice or a new process or a new workflow or a new way you're documenting or a new form of API. You can always be testing those things, because that's what's really great about the compartmentalization of design systems sometimes, is that you can sort of treat it compartmentalized. You can kind of test and pilot in that way, and then as you're finding new things that work, you can scale those things and you can have it influence more and more parts of the system too. And so I think, you know, any point can be the beginning, even if you're 5 years in or 10 years in, or if you're like, we don't have anything, we're just starting right now.
I think I would build upon that by saying I like the incremental nature that Dan's talking about. And one question you can ask yourself is, what's the cost of inaction? What if we don't do anything? And in fact, if you've got an awesome design system, what if we turned it off right now? We took all those people working on the design system and put them somewhere else. So what are we going to lose? What are we going to risk? And oftentimes selling a design system can trigger change more when you play to risk or threat, as opposed to you play to sometimes opportunity or growth. And so I remember my favorite design system I ever worked on was sold the moment someone said, oh, is this going to help us with our accessibility problem? Sold. And that, like, it was 15 minutes into an hour-long meeting. We could have stood up and walked out the door, and we had funding for a year. And so when you think about when you inherit a poor design system, like, without knowing what poor means, I mean, it can mean a lot of different things. How can you frame the cost of, or how can you create a contrast between what you could do and achieve those incremental results and what you wouldn't end up doing and where the business might end up as a result?
Yeah, I like that a lot, that the proving value through those maybe unconventional ways too. Zach, is that something that you have to do at GoFundMe? Is, you know, what does your type of leadership look like? Like, what are the types of conversations that you're having on your team?
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to remember is that, like, no product is ever done and no product is perfect. So your design system is a product that applies to that as well. There's always going to be debt to pay down, whether it's design or technology, and there's always going to be new shiny things to go after to innovate or push the design language forward. And you have to kind of balance that and go for the things that will deliver the most impact at that time. Yeah.
Awesome. Fantastic. That was a great little metaphorical kind of bone stretch for us here now too. We can pop right back in and jump right into a very fun section about proving value. So one of the things too, Dan, that you had mentioned before when we were asking how can teams demonstrate the value of their design system using sort of data analytics, you brought up the point that teams actually don't share enough or often enough, and about creating a regular practice of sharing these insights is the first step. So how else can teams use that in order to help prove value to their stakeholders?
So I think that one of the premises of design systems, and I think why a lot of people, designers in particular, get involved with design systems, is some discontent, right? Some like, we're not using the same shade of red, across, or we're not consistent, or our brand is appearing different, whatever the impetus is for that. There's usually some discontent where someone goes like, I want to be either in charge of or involved in fixing that thing or moving it towards something more that I think is more progressive or more better somehow for us, however they define that somehow. And what's inherent in that is the idea that like you have some intention that you're trying to manifest, right? And that might manifest in the way of a system that others can follow, whether that's guidelines or that's documentation or that's components or tools or whatever. And so I think that's cool, but I see teams not continuing that idea. So they have some intention and then they stop. They never declare their intention. They have this idea in their heads, but they never say to stakeholders before they start building components, right? They never say, hey, everyone, here's what we're going to try and do over the next 6 months. We're going to try and improve the experience of our forms before they build anything. Because if they had done that, when I see a handful of teams do that, it gives people the ability to opt into that and be part of that journey with them, to go like, oh, you're gonna improve forms here at our organization. That's great. Or actually, that's the wrong priority. We actually need to improve this other thing instead. And before you build anything, but what I see a lot of teams doing is they hop right into the building, right into the making. We're going to do this thing. And then 6 months later, they emerge with this thing that no one knew they were working on. And so like just the act of sharing something and saying like, here's what we're going to do, right? And then getting people to go like, sounds like a good idea. I'm bought in conceptually. Like I'm not necessarily on board quite yet, but like I'm not vetoing anything. Great. So now we have some at least conceptual buy-in. We start building that thing. We start sharing those ideas and having a regular practice of sharing. That buys people into it and makes them feel like they're part of the journey with you and that they can influence it. And I don't think it's a showpiece. I don't think that's something that you do just to say that you did it. You actually can involve people and allow them to influence your roadmap, influence how you're making things, what you're making them for, who you're making them for. I think it just brings people along on that journey and gets people more invested in the design system, the people who you want to be the customers. And so even before did this design system prove value, it's, are we even sharing what we're doing? Because if we're not sharing what we're doing, then when we're done, it's going to be a surprise to everyone. And a lot of times it's hard to prove value when people are surprised by the thing that they didn't even know was happening. It's hard for them to see value through that. So I think the communication part of it is overlooked oftentimes. I think that's something, even if we're just sharing, not even the value we're providing, because at some point you're not providing value yet. But just sharing that this is what we're doing, this is how we're doing it, this is how we're going about it. I think that lets people be part of it. And a lot of times they don't, people don't need to see value as much as they just want to be part of it. So I think that's an often overlooked part.
Awesome. Yeah, bring the people in, make everybody feel part of it. I like that a lot. Should be on a little needlepoint pillow in every design system team's office. Moving on for that too. So, Nathan, one of the things you mentioned before was how adoption metrics can be used as an input to a formula to determine return on value, but often they are woefully inadequate because they vary industry to industry. So what are your thoughts on that?
The return on investment conversation is one that vexes me as a statistician and mathematician, because when we talk about design system measurement, there's things like coverage and productivity and efficiency and satisfaction and consistency. Like, there's all these different things that you can measure. But now you're like, how do all of those like lead into this? It's valuable. There's a return on investment. And so you can do some Google searching, or actually I can provide some links afterwards if you'd like, around all the articles written on design system return on investment. And it seemed like about 2 to 3 years ago, the complexity of those formulas started to really ratchet up, which I was digging. I was like, oh, what dimensions, what variables they're using, how are they balancing these things? How are they going to take that 37% more efficient number that came from one of the articles, and it wasn't 37, but it was a number like 37, and put it into their formula, and then calculate the hundreds of millions of dollars that the design system saved, even though the company's only worth $10 million. So like, how do you create this formula? One person even wrote a ROI formula to rule them all, which I thought was the coolest. And then I completely used that to create a whole different formula on my own to characterize the return on investment in a different way. And so all that to say, you can read all those articles, be inspired by all those things, but it might be that the VP of finance at a Fortune 50 company looks at what you estimated and says, like, how much more efficient? Just give me like a rule of thumb. I don't know, 25% efficiency gain for developers working on front end. Okay, how many developers do we have? About 500. Okay, they create a basic thing, like they're writing on a napkin. They see a number that says 10 million. Yeah, we can invest. Okay, let's invest that in the design system. I'm like, there's no data behind that whatsoever, but that made someone have a decision, make a decision in a place of power that invested in the design system. So while I find that woefully inadequate, and I sort of like question the role of the VP of Finance. You're really doing your job well. At least it got us to where we wanted to go, and change the way that the company operated. So make sure that you're talking at a level of formality and fidelity of the data that you have, and being able to use that data to tell a compelling story to influence.
That's awesome. Yeah. And Zach, one of the things too that you were mentioning before was similar in that line of subjectivity, but it's important for you to sort of get a benchmark so you can demonstrate improvement over time or know things when they're dipping, and that the definition of good is largely subjective for you. So like, what does that mean for you and for the organization?
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways that we kind of got to that ROI question was we actually just asked our users how much time the design system they estimate saves them. I think how many hours per month is how we framed it. And then we like put that data with like some average like salaries, and ultimately we're able to estimate that, hey, the system in its current state saves up to $1 million a year. And so it's not, while not like super accurate, you know, there's a margin of error there, and there's like more details you can go into, but that was a nice round number. That was like the high end of that we were able to get to just by asking people how much time do you feel like this saves you. So that's one way to get to that. But yeah, in terms of any sort of metrics that you're tracking, and you want to prove that you're moving the needle the right way over time, you have to, you know, first establish that benchmark and define what good means for you. Because even if I arbitrarily say like, oh, well, let's just go with the 80-20 rule and say that like 80% of components in production should be design system components, is where like, I don't know, that came from nowhere. It came out of the ether, right? Like you need to actually look at what your current adoption rate is. First, answer the question, are people using the design system? If the answer is yes, then look at your current adoption rate and then see how you can move that up. Or when you check it next, if it's dipped, start to interrogate that and figure out why.
Awesome. And sort of moving on into that too, you know, this is a big topic, a big focus of us here at Omlet, of proving value, you know, using data to prove the value of your design system. You had also mentioned that case too, where you were, you know, using it to help identify like what teams were building more custom versus sheet solutions over time. That knowledge helped you actually make the case to increase the size of your team. So what else sort of went into that decision? I know a lot of the talk was about the story behind it too, but then, you know, did you also use data that you got from Omlet as well, or how did that all look for you?
Yeah, so yeah, Omlet was really beneficial to us for it came into play in a few ways. So we set it up, and we had been monitoring the component usage like weekly. We use GitHub Actions to set up automated weekly tasks to scan two different code bases. One's the design system, and one is the production code base, and determine how components are being used. Has a really nice dashboard that then you can kind of dive into, and it's interactive charts and graphs and stuff. But one quarter we reported the adoption rate as like 80 something percent. And then the next quarter when we looked at it, it had dipped like a fraction of a percent. So we're like, why is that? Well, in the Omlet dashboard, you can go in and see, oh, sheet is a new custom component that you know, newly created that is used a lot, and it's like listed at the top there because the usage count is higher than others. And then it's like, oh, there's a sheet, there's a center modal, there's a peak modal, there's all these different things. We knew that the engineering teams had been wanting modals from us for a while, but our team is small, so we just hadn't been able to prioritize it with the other things we had going on that we knew also deliver a lot of value. So we could take that dip in adoption to leadership and say, hey, this is what's behind it. It's that teams are now making their own modal solutions because we can't ship those to them fast enough. in order for us to keep up with the pace that we need to meet the needs of our product teams, we need another design engineer, we need another designer. And they were very receptive to that.
Awesome. Very cool. That's fantastic. And throwing it back to Nathan too, of course, you work with so many teams over, you have worked with so many teams over the years and will continue to do so. What are some of the examples as well too that you've seen about teams using data in order to prove that value of design system to the stakeholders?
Well, it's interesting. I lost my train of thought. Dan, do you want to pick that one up? Because I totally lost my train of thought.
I'll take it and jump back in.
Right.
Jump back in when you're ready.
Okay. Cool.
I'm going to pick up what Nathan had mentioned earlier, which is that in terms of data, I find one piece of data particularly compelling over others, and it's related to a question that's in the chat and in the Q&A from Adam, which is like, what is a good adoption rate? And maybe we'll touch that later on in the Q&A, but just to bring it here, I find that to be, and no offense, Adam, but like sort of an irrelevant question. Like what is a good adoption rate? And I've worked with 3 companies before. All 3 of them have had 90 to 100% adoption rates, which is like, wow, that's incredible. 90% to 100%. For 2 of those companies, the adoption rate did not translate to any sort of cultural or technical change that was meaningful. So it was like they had a lot of adoption, nothing really changed, like a little bit in the tooling, but nothing significant. For another one of those companies that was around like 95 or whatever they had adoption rate, it was significant change all across the enterprise, right? So it's like, so what I found in that is it's not directly related to the adoption rate, right? The adoption rate is a lagging indicator of something, right? It's not a leading indicator. And so that's to me what's a little bit tough about adoption rate. And in terms of using data, the one piece of data that I find to be compelling is actually the ROI ratio, because essentially the ROI ratio needs to be greater than 1. And then what I found is that people are willing to invest if it's greater than 1, right? If we put 100 hours in and we save 100 hours, it's not really worth it. We just broke even on something, which is like, okay. If we put 100 hours into something and we save 200 hours, or if you want to relate that to money or other kinds of currency, we will invest $1 million in it and we'll save 2 million, or we'll make back 2 million. The ratio is higher, right? Higher than 1. And so it's worth investing in. How much greater than 1? Actually, I find doesn't matter that much. It just becomes a more compelling case, which is fine. But the answer is still yes. It becomes a stronger yes, I guess. But there's no change. The answer is still yes. We should do this, or we should invest in it, or invest more in it. So, in terms of what data I think is important, that to me is the thing that I'm always kind of looking for. Is like what drives that ratio to higher than 1. And a lot of times that comes from the insights that's like this component led to it, or this usage led to it, or this team using it, or this side of the organization using it. So I think we need metrics and we need dashboards and we need things like that to be able to surface those insights. But really it's not driving at value quite yet until you can relate it to, it is worth it for us to do this versus it is not worth it for us to do this.
Yeah, if I could like build upon what Dan said, to me, it's all when you said relative to something else is really what keys me. Because if you have a design system that you invest 100 and you get 200 out of it, great. That's a great return on investment. Is it actually going to be the best return on investment that they can get? Because there might be 2 other initiatives that return 400 and 600, in which case you still don't get selected. And so how are you also framing the value of the design system relative to all the other choices that they might have in front of them? And is the design system going to be producing the most value for the way that the business wants to grow? Bring it back a little bit to where Zach was at too, with the what you get out of Omlet. Omlet frames a lot of what you're seeing with adoption as green in the interface. And a lot of where adoption isn't occurring is yellow. And so when you look at Omlet, you might say, okay, this thing's trending more and more green. Is our objective, or when you have somebody you're communicating with, is the objective, okay, so you want to paint the world green with all these charts? I'm not sure I agree. And even Zach, your example, it was the relative quantity of components started to go down. But actually, that might be a good sign that experimentation is happening to produce this modal and that modal and that modal. And getting that local experimentation is a good story that then you consolidate into something that is core system modal, that you bring those things into the system and you get reintegration from those other teams that made their fluffy little modals everywhere else to use your modals instead eventually. And so when you think about it, design systems aren't meant to paint the world completely green 100%. That is not the Omlet story that you want. You want the growth and the use of the design system to grow. And you actually want to continue to encourage everyone else to continue designing and building systematically, making components, and oftentimes sharing their own components that didn't come from, quote unquote, the core of the system too. So a little bit of yellow, or actually a lot of yellow, might be a really healthy thing in the Omlet story.
That's fantastic. I think too, yeah, a round of applause for that. That was a beautiful way to wrap up the final section. That actually reminds me too, Dan, of one thing that you had posted a little while ago too, about the least used components actually being one of your favorite features of Omelet, because you're able to start seeing those things. You're able to start seeing where people are making, unique components versus actually using the ones in the design system, maybe figuring out why. So hopefully Omelet is at that start of that story to help you start identifying those cases and all of
I
that.
think that's the point of surfacing insights, is that like when you surface data, the data often doesn't tell you enough about it. So you have to dig into the data to go like, why is this thing happening this way? And then you discover all these stories. Oh, they didn't use this because they are building their own thing and we didn't even know about it. Now it's a point of collaboration. So even, I love how Nathan's talking about it, like green and yellow and red doesn't necessarily mean bad and green doesn't necessarily mean good all the time. It just means like, look here. And so, I tend to look at the polar edges to go like, what's happening at the edges of this, where this is like so high or so low. This is something that we need to investigate and something that we need to look into, because then you surface those stories, and think when you surface the stories, that's when they turn into insights, from data. If we don't have data, it's a non-starter, right? It's because we don't know what to look at anymore. So we need the data in order to lead us to insights, which then eventually lead us to value.
Awesome. Fantastic. I think that was a beautiful way to end out that section. Now we can dive into the Q&A section for a little bit, and then send everybody on their way to have a great rest of your week. But yeah, I think it would be really great if we could bring back that Adam question in light of painting everything green/yellow, and give Nathan and Zach maybe a chance to speak to this as well too. I know we've had some fantastic conversation about it. Love to continue that.
Good adoption rate. I think it really depends on the kind of system you have. Some design systems are embedded into the content management system, like for a marketing site. So if your adoption rate isn't 100% or like 90%, you got a serious problem. But if you have a product-oriented organization, you've got a design system, you might see adoption grow from 10 to 30 to 50 to 70% over years. Over 4 years, essentially. And so it really depends on the ambition, the scale, and also the organizational sort of makeup that you're going to be confronted with.
Yeah, I'll just +1 that.
Perfect. Fantastic way to end out Adam's question. Here's a great question here from Florian. Mentioned they are currently in the progress of creating a new version of a design system in a well-established within the company with a complete new tech stack. Do you have recommendations regarding a migration path, legacy to future system, and conduct an inventory?
Well, two things that occur to me is the divide between how are you going to make the system on a new platform and how are they going to use the system on a new platform, right, migrating from their old stuff. And so I like the concept of thinking around inventories and audits, both of the ecosystem of what everybody's adopted and sort of the scale of how many things they're going to need to migrate, and also the things that we're going to make. And are we going to have parity with the new stuff, or is the new stuff going to be able to serve all the needs that the old stuff is going to serve, hopefully plus some other things? And are we going to retire some things that the old stuff did that nobody needs anymore? And so inventories are going to be a starting point for having that conversation.
I'll just point to something that Nathan published a couple of years ago that I always point to in this conversation, which is a really handy graph of must/should/could a product adopt a system. And it gives a really simple and great clear visualization of like, not everything needs to be on the design system and not everything needs to be on the design system right away. So there is a priority of migration, no matter, especially as you have multiple apps and sites and kiosks and, all those kinds of things. And what I like about it is like, it makes very clear that products or features that have a lot of upcoming investment and are maybe in the newer stage, those are probably higher priority in the migration path. And then legacy apps or things that have no investment from the business, like maybe you never even have to migrate those. And I think that there's this tendency to go like, well, once we have a design system, everything's got to be on it. And I just don't think that that's realistic or pragmatic. And it's also not important to have everything on it. There are some things that need to be on a design system because those are things that are drivers of your business somehow for whatever reasons. And then there are other things that it's okay for those things to be legacy. I think the idea that a design system has to be all or nothing, I think is too much of a fiction and too unrealistic. And I think the reality of organizations is that there are things on different tech stacks. There are things on different platforms with different dependencies. And I think that's okay as long as you've got the right things on the design system. And in a lot of cases, those right things are the things that are the most important for your organization, for your users of the organization or your customers of the organization. So I like that slide. I'll link it up here in the chat. I think I refer to it all the time. Nathan, I don't know if you have an updated version of that, but the one that you have is still great.
I got to make sure I know exactly which one you're referring to. So why don't you post it?
I'll link it up. Yeah, I'll link it up.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. And I think we've got time for one more question before we wrap everything up from Greg. So to the panel, can you talk a little bit more about how to demonstrate or communicate the value of design system parts when the pace of product development is much faster than the pace of design system progress?
I think it speaks to the nature of how coupled you want your design system to be to the product. In smaller ecosystems of adopters, the system typically moves faster, oriented more closely around the adopters, as opposed to, I would suspect, Salesforce Lightning, which has to only deprecate and never EOL anything. They're probably going to be really deliberate and slow about the hundreds of different adopters that they have. And so those efforts might be more decoupled in a way. And so I would orient around how closely coupled should they be. And typically in design systems at scale that I work with tend to be more decoupled and find their regular moments to sync what they're making and delivering with who's consuming and what they're going to need delivered, let's say on quarterly or biannually or whatever that pace might be.
I think this question also relates to, I think Sylvia had a question earlier about pace layers, the Stewart Brand's pace layers. And Josh Clark from Big Medium wrote a really great article about this recently as it relates to design systems. So to Greg's question here about like how to demonstrate the value of design system parts, design systems sit naturally at the culture layer or even farther down at the nature layer, and those are the slowest moving pace layers. And so sometimes to demonstrate the value of a design system, you have to find a way for those to permeate the topmost layer, which is the fastest layer, which is the fashion layer. If it constantly sits in culture and governance and infrastructure and some of the slower paced layers, it's hard to prove the value of it because people don't see it. It's not as visible. That's why those are slower moving layers, because it's hard to change, it's hard to move. And you don't want them to move as often as you want fashion or commerce to move as a pace layer. So you've got to surface that somehow in the fashion layer of what your organization is doing. So a lot of times, what does that mean? That relates to maybe a flagship feature that you're about to release or are releasing, something that's very visible, something that's very marketable. If you can move your design system more closer to those fashion layers, it helps to demonstrate the value because it happens fast. And because it becomes more visible more easily and also more recently, as opposed to some of the slower layers, you just don't see the value for a long time. And in that time, a lot of design system teams get defunded or split apart or move to part-time or a different model, instead. And so if you can move it to one of the faster layers, or at least have it touch one of the faster layers, you have the ability to create some or display some value faster.
Yeah, if I could recall something that Nathan said earlier too, is if those teams are moving that fast, they're probably doing a lot of experimentation and finding a lot of things that work. And hopefully they are componentizing their solutions. And if not, that's a good way for the design system team to kind of jump in and say, hey, can we make a component out of this? And if they are already doing components, then that's a good source for you to curate and kind of cherry pick things that work and pull those into the system. And then they're represented in the system, right? The solutions they've built are in there.
I think also to flip it on its head, there are times when you want to foster experimentations, and there's times when you need to revise your foundations. I'm dealing with one client where there's 3 different projects, big projects going on for 2024, where this team needs really large inputs and really large, like comfortable kinds of displays. And that team needs really compact buttons and list items and so on. You could say, okay, both teams, you can experiment and so on, but at a minimum, the system has to be involved in those efforts, because what the community might actually ultimately need by the end of 2024, density dials across the entire catalog of everything that you do. And so you might have a lot of experimentation, and that's the only way they can reach their quarterly or semi-annual goals. And that's okay, but you better be passing the puck, as they say, to the space where everybody wants to be, with the system's foundations to support dials to tune for size and density and all those other things, so that it's all built in the future.
Awesome. That was a fantastic way to wrap everything up. Before we go, I wanted to give everybody a chance. Use the emojis at the bottom of the toolbar here to show our presenters some love. Zach Phillips, Nathan Curtis, and Dan Mall, thank you all very, very much. If we didn't get to your questions, please feel free to connect with us outside of this webinar. Of course, too, you can find Nathan, Dan, and Zach all on LinkedIn, on Twitter. Still not calling it X yet, because I don't know if too many people will know what that is, and possibly Threads. We also, too, we wanted to take this opportunity to let everybody know that anybody can get started with a 30-day free trial of Omlet at omlet.dev. And if you're a developer, you can get started right away. If you're a designer, you can ask your developer to scan your code so you can get your team insights. And we know design system improvements are on the 2024 roadmap for a lot of teams. So to celebrate, we're actually running a special offer on Omlet. I just went ahead and posted the information in the comments. However, we're offering up to 50% savings, and to claim it, all you have to do is just email us at hi@omlet.dev, and we will be in touch. But I really appreciate everybody for sticking around and chatting with us here today. It was a fantastic session. We will have a little Omlet demo from our very own Josh to play us out with too. But before we go, again, just wanted to thank all of our attendees here today, our panelists, and everybody for making it a great time. And hopefully everybody has a great rest of your week and a great rest of your year. But without further ado, I think we can go ahead and get started with the little demo if anybody wants to stick around, and we'll see you all later. Thank you all so much.
Hey there, my name is Josh, and I'm excited to walk you through Omlet, a component analytics tool that eliminates manually measuring your design system usage and helps speed up decision making for component library improvements. All I need to do is run Omlet's command line tool here, and Omlet will parse your code repository and get component and prop usage information. Typically, scanning your code base takes several time-consuming and manual steps, but Omlet takes care of all that for you. And just like that, it's done, and we can take a look at the results here. At the main dashboard, the first chart I see is our overall adoption of our core library over time. But I have several more useful charts right out of the box that give me immediate insight into how my design system is used, such as most used components from my non-core library, you might refer to those as custom components, or least used props. Now let's take a look at the chart showing core versus custom component adoption by project, and I can quickly see which projects or teams are adopting our design system. This is a starting point to understand why one team may be adopting your design system more than others. And of course, from here, you'll have your own questions, and we can answer those by creating your own custom analysis. For example, if our design system has 2 versions and we recently released version 2, I want to know which projects have adopted version 2 or are still on version 1. Omlet makes it easy to analyze my projects. I can filter by tags that I've created, and I have these custom tags for each design system and then break them down for comparison. And now here we have a full view into the design system adoption by version across all my projects. Looks like this project hasn't started adopting version 2 yet. This one is at 28% adoption, and we're looking good with full adoption of version 2 on this project. Omlet not only analyzes your design system adoption, but is also a catalog for all your components and props, whether they're a part of your core design system or custom. Part of my job is to keep track of recently created components, and I'll take a look at a new component here and see where it's used. Now I can get a full view into the dependency tree for this component, and I can see its relationships and can make better decisions on why this component was created, if it should be officially adopted, or determine if it's redundant. I can also get insights into how props are used across my components. So for example, if I see that there's a prop that isn't used in all of the times that this component is used, that's a good signal for me to remove the prop completely and simplify the component. Omlet not only gives me insight into components props, but also which values are sent to each prop. I can use this information to make better decisions on what to add, remove, or adjust in our design system. And that's only a little taste of what we've been cooking up with Omlet and the kind of detailed look into your design system usage it can give you. Omlet is free to try, so have a bite. And I've actually been told not to do any of these egg puns, so I'm kind of taking a big risk here. So check it out, make improvements with confidence, and bring quantifiable insights that help demonstrate the value of your design system. I'm gonna let you go now.